For the last 30 minutes, he had watched his gorgeous wife make her way across the ballroom so that when the ball dropped at midnight, she would be as far away from her husband as possible. Surrounded by rich, self-satisfied peers, she will be passed around like a plate of Olivier, kissed and caressed by all the managers where he worked, and with special tenderness by his born-rich, imbecile boss. He knew this because his company's New Year's party had been like this for the past 2 years. The first year he accepted it, blaming it on too much champagne. However, last year, the bugle sounded too loudly, and he began to make preparations. Feeling a tug on his coat, he turned to face Deirdre, Josephine's best friend and accomplice. "Happy New Year, Mike," she exclaimed, reaching up to pull his head down for the annual pity kiss. He barely brushed his lips against hers before pulling away and looking into her brown eyes. Deirdre was another socialite, a trust fund child like his wife, from an even wealthier family than Joe's. He expected to see the slight smirk she usually gave him, explaining that she knew something he didn't know because she was a pillar noblewoman like his wife and his boss. Instead, he saw 2 new emotions: pity and concern. "Mike, don't take this so seriously. She simply exchanges kisses, according to the old New Year's tradition. She will return after a while, no worse, and will show you again how much she loves you." He looked at her skeptically. Deirdre tried to calm him down. "She really loves you, you know. She's just very sociable, lively and impulsive, and you're intellectual and silent. Sometimes she needs a chance to be with others who are more like her, but spending time with them only deepens her love for you." "Okay, Deirdre. So that's why she spent the entire Christmas party at her company under the mistletoe with her co-workers? We go to her Christmas party, and she spends the night dancing and kissing with the executives of her company, and here at my company's New Year's Eve ball, she spends the night dancing and kissing, no, sucking, with the executives of my company. So by kissing everyone at the party except me, she begins to appreciate me in a new way? Interesting concept. Tell me, is this another New Year's tradition, kissing imbecile George a dozen times? Or is this just her way of showing her love for me because she knows how much I hate this bitch?" To her credit, Deirdre had enough self-control to be embarrassed. She couldn't hold my gaze, so she turned away and tried again. "Mike, I see how upset you are, but you have to understand." "Really, Deirdre? I think I understand. For the first time in our 5 years of marriage, I think I truly understand." I turned my back to her, returned to our table, took out and opened the briefcase that I had placed under the table, and pulled out a rather large, brightly wrapped package. With my back to her, I took the ring off my finger and tied it in the middle of the bow that she had to remove to open the package. Turning to Deirdre, I handed the package. "I'll leave now. Please pass this on to your friend when or if she breaks the grip of the men around her. Give her my Happy New Year wishes, and I hope next year she gets everything she deserves." I turned to leave, but Deirdre pulled me by the arm. "Don't go, Mike. I'll go get her. She's had too much champagne again. You must take her home." "No, Deirdre, you don't need to. She has a room rented here at the hotel. She was here all day, entertaining the men while I worked. Of course, you know all this because you were here with her. She has her own car, clothes, everything she needs. I'm sure at least one of the gentlemen she's currently kissing will be more than happy to make her happy. Or maybe they will all be happy. Don't look at me like that. You told me the same lies last year. I gave her this year to decide. She decided, and so did I. Goodbye, Deirdre. I can't help but say that it will be a relief for me to never see you again." As I left the ballroom, I nodded to Helen, the HR director, with whom I had spent the first half of the day while my boss and his buddies helped it get things done at the hotel. In reality, he was in a luxury suite, which he paid for with a company credit card, and had sex with my wife. Actually, I should have said they were in a luxury suite having sex with my wife, and I have photos and videos to prove it. Helen has one too, and the chairman of the board will have it within minutes. After I left the ballroom, Helen and her husband walked toward the crowd of men around Josephine. Deirdre made her way through the crowd of men, many of whom insisted on kissing her in the grand tradition. Several people tried to pester Helen, but they seemed to be put off by the scowl of her husband, a former American football offensive lineman. She made her way through the crowd to CEO George Burke and his companion, a little ahead of Deirdre. She stopped her husband a couple of meters away and watched. Deirdre's confused look and shrill cry of her name caught Joe's attention, and she broke George's embrace. She frowned at her friend's frightened look. Helen smiled. Deirdre handed over the luxuriously wrapped gift and said something to Joe, who took the package, leaned closer, and seemed to ask Deirdre to repeat herself. "Mike left this for you. He's gone, Joe. He watched you flirt and cuddle all night. And when you started kissing all these men, he gave me this package and left." Joe smiled. "Oh, you know, Mike, he throws these little fits when I don't pay attention to him for a few minutes. I will come home, ask him for forgiveness, and have sex with him. After that, he will forgive me and everything will be fine with us. He loves me. See, even when he gets angry, he leaves my gift. Let's see what it is." "Joe, I don't think this is a gift," Deirdre began, but Joe was already busily untying the ribbon to open the package. When the ring fell to the ground, she paused, frowned, and asked, "What is this?" George bent down, picked it up, handed it to her, and grinned. "Isn't this your husband's wedding ring?" She stopped tearing the paper, looked at him puzzled, and took the ring. She looked at Deirdre, who muttered, "I tried to tell you." Joe began to tear the wrapping off the gift and found a white gift box inside. Reassured, she smiled, shook the box, and said, "It's heavy," and began to cut the tape on each side with my fingernail. When the tape on the third side broke, the contents of the box fell out and scattered on the floor. She squatted down to pick up the fallen glossy sheets. Others squatted and picked up those that slid near them. Suddenly everyone froze. Joe's eyes widened and she screamed, "No!" This cry attracted the attention of others, and even more people entered their circle. Deirdre's eyes also widened in disbelief. She looked up and saw the look of horror on George's face. He picked up the 20x30cm glossy color photograph lying at his feet, pressed it against his expensive suit, and spontaneously shouted, "What the fuck, Joe?" loud enough for everyone nearby to hear him. Everyone looked at the photos lying around and saw Joe having sex with people other than her husband. There were many photographs of Joe and George, as well as Joe with other executives at Mike's company, Joe's co-workers, and Joe's bosses. There weren't enough to cover everything in the Kama Sutra, but Mike did a good job of selecting photos that proved that Josephine was willing to have different types of sex, with men in any combination and in any number. Faced with photographs of her sexual adventures, Joe fainted. She fell backwards, and only George's substituted shoe saved her head from hitting the tiled floor and a possible concussion. Deirdre knelt down next to her, lifted her head, lightly slapped her across the face, and frantically screamed, "Joe! Joe! Are you okay, Joe? Talk to me, Joe! Are you okay?" While both women lay on the floor, others began to pick up the photographs and look at them. One woman turned and hit her husband as hard as she could as he looked down at the photo he was holding. "You lustful goat! No wonder you don't have the strength to satisfy me!" He stared at her in stunned silence until she swung her purse and hit him in the right eye. He covered his eye, screamed in pain, and then collapsed to the floor as she kicked him in the groin with her pointy shoe. The woman knelt down and began methodically sorting through the photographs on the floor. She paused, looked up and stated, "You bitches who are married to the management of Taylor and Son might want to take some of these photos and check them out. There are photos of other husbands having sex with these sluts. If you want to save money on a divorce lawyer, give me a call and I'll see if I can find us a group rate." 9 other women knelt down and began looking at the photographs as the men began to retreat. "There are also flash drives here," one of them announced loudly. "It is unknown what is on them." "You stinking bastard!" a beautiful blonde shouted at a well-dressed elderly man. "Do you remember our marriage contract? You're bankrupt, bastard." "Baby, I'm sorry. It didn't mean anything. She kept pestering me and I finally gave in, But that was only one time, and she still wasn't as good as you." "Lying bastard!" the blonde screamed, holding out 2 more photos of her husband having dirty sex with Joe. The blonde stood up and walked towards him with fury in her eyes, waving photographs and swearing at the top of her lungs. He stepped back, then turned and ran away. Another woman sobbed, clutching one hand to her chest and waving a photograph in the other. Her husband, hiding his face in his hands, also sobbed. The man picked up a photo from the floor, then showed it to the gorgeous woman standing in front of him, and said loudly, "You slut told me that I would never have a threesome because you would never do it with a woman." She blushed, turned and ran away, staggering on her 10-centimeter heels. Another woman selected 6 photographs from the pile and called out names as she walked toward the center of the ballroom. The puzzled woman stopped her, took the photograph, stared at it, and turned to her husband with a murderous expression on her face. He began to retreat as she trotted towards him, waving the photograph. This scene was repeated 5 more times, and each time the victim's companions were hit in the ears and eyes. Joe had already woken up and was looking at what was happening around her with glazed eyes. A man in an expensive tuxedo knelt next to her. He asked, "Are you okay?" She looked at him curiously and nodded. He asked, "Who are you? Can I help?" "I'm Josephine Lord," she answered gloomily. "But I don't think anyone can help me now." "Are you Josephine Reynolds Lord?" he asked incredulously. She nodded and asked, "I am. Who are you?" The man handed her a stack of papers that he was carrying with him, took a photo of it on his phone, and loudly declared, "I am a bailiff. You have already been served, Josephine Reynolds Lord." These documents, as well as the photographs and videos attached to them, prove the fact of adultery, which is stated in Michael Morris Lord's divorce petition. He turned to the large group. "Ladies, gentlemen, if you haven't had a chance to view the photos, just order a copy of the divorce papers, which are public records available on the internet. It lists the names of all the people Joe S.B. has had sex with in the last year, as well as where and when. For a nominal fee, I can provide a link to Joe S.B.'s website, which fully details her exploits since January 1st of last year. If you would like to review them to determine whether your husband or wife has been involved in a paired 3-way, 4-way, or more sexual relationship with SB, you can contact me online at cheatingspousepi.com, and for a nominal fee, a link will be provided on its website. For an additional fee, I can provide digital copies of participant activities. You will find this type of evidence very useful in court. I look forward to your call." He bowed deeply and walked away, leaving tears, fear, and panic in his wake. He's probably going to hell for this stunt, but he got paid very, very well for it. Besides, this was New York and his office was in New Jersey, where his family was very influential. Joe still had the divorce papers in her lap, leaning back in her friend's arms, her mouth open in disbelief. She looked at the faces gathered around her and saw hatred, pity, anger, and anxiety. The inevitable admiration, lust, and envy that she had known all her privileged life were completely absent, and the enormity of her loss and shame finally became apparent. She clung to Deirdre again and buried her face in her friend's chest, sobbing inconsolably. George Taylor ordered his henchmen to pick up those damn photographs and burn them. Looking directly at Helen, he ordered, "I want a letter of reprimand to Mike Lord on my desk on Monday with my dismissal papers underneath it." With a neutral expression, Helen stated, "I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, but Mr. Lord resigned this afternoon. He gave 2 weeks' notice, used the leave you signed up for last week, collected all his supplies and materials, and left the building. I will not accept his resignation. I will fire him after a reprimand. He will never work in this business again. Sorry again, Mr. Taylor, but before he left, he met with the chairman of the board, and your father accepted his resignation. Mr. Lord already has another job, with one of the firms he consulted with your written permission, sir." Taylor's face was so red that listeners and spectators feared he would have a stroke as he muttered loud curses at his father and Mike Lord. Helen and her husband watched his embarrassment with glee. clasping each other's hands in delight, naturally maintaining a neutral facial expression. Mike Lord was driving from New York in a new four-wheel drive Chevrolet High Country Suburban with a 6.2L turbo diesel engine ordered over standard. He specially ordered an SUV in the fall, as soon as new models became available, and it was delivered to him yesterday. The navigator reported that the route he had chosen would take 24 hours and 32 minutes to get to his new home in Austin, Texas. He knew it would actually take the better part of a week, because the farm boy from Idaho was going to absorb the culture of the rural states he would be passing through. When he reached Virginia, he intended to abandon the main highways, take the country roads that John Denver sang about, and visit the small towns in the Carolinas that Mary Chapin Carpenter sang about. He was going to try the homemade jellies and jams sold in roadside stands and small local shops, and eat where the locals ate, away from the highways and the rushing, bustling people and lifestyle he had come to hate. Their checking and savings accounts were separated, but only after he bought his SUV. Since she had earned 10 times that amount throughout their marriage, an $88,000 car would do little to even the score. But he was happy to use at least some of her money to buy it. Under the terms he proposed, he would keep his investments and pension funds, and she would keep hers. He was leaving her the penthuse, and no claim on her trust fund if she accepted his generous terms and signed divorce papers within 10 days. The radio was tuned to Sirius XM's top traditional country station, The Roadhouse. Joe hated country music almost as much as she hated retro music. So the next station will be classic vinyl. Now he was his own master, and not the ignorant cuckold that she had made him out to be for at least 2 years. He took his life into his own hands when the New Year's ball dropped last year and spent the entire year gathering his thoughts. Perhaps Taylor & Son would survive his departure, but he seriously doubted it. Working under George's inept leadership and deprived of the many design improvements and patents that Mikey had brought to the company over the past 5 years, he expected it to collapse within a year or two. He smiled at the thought, knowing that his work had accounted for more than half of the previous year's new sales and profits, and that he had the best developments and design improvements ready to go as soon as his new company could get up and running. Oh, his old boss, George's current chairman and dad, Randolph Taylor, will likely sell the business before it collapses, but George will be exposed as the inept charlatan he is before that happens. The thought of this made him smile. Tonight he exposed George and his own whore wife as immoral and unprincipled scum of society. Over the next year, he will expose George's ineptitude as a businessman when his new company squashes his old one like a bug that has just been smeared on the windshield. Thinking about it made him smile. He wouldn't mind being a bug on the wall, a bystander when Josephine's parents find out about his antics at the ball. Helen had already called him to tell him how wonderful everything had turned out. Having her scatter photos all over the ballroom was beyond his wildest dreams, even though he had deliberately designed the box so that it would fall apart when the film was cut on 3 sides. Her parents looked down on him from the beginning and were dismayed when their precious, perfect daughter decided to marry him. After all, he didn't even have an Ivy League education. That an engineering degree from the Colorado School of Mines and a master's degree from the University of Michigan made him highly sought after in his field meant nothing. Better a liberal arts education from Brown than such a mediocre pedigree. He smiled, thinking about the destruction he had caused and what he would do in the future. Deirdre and her husband Albert took Josephine home. As soon as they entered the house and she looked around, Joe began to sob again. On the way home, she rehearsed her speech for Mike. She had to explain that her affairs did not mean anything to her and did not harm their marriage. It was just a vacation or an attempt to influence decisions that affected her and Mike, to make their lives better. Her having sex with others only helped them improve their sex lives, she explained. It brought her sexual desire back under control when it ran wild, and she learned what she used to please her husband to spice up their love life. It sounded funny even to her, and she knew Mike wouldn't buy it. In truth, he was a real stickler for marriage vows. Even talking about swapping partners or role-playing with others made him furious. Why then did she think he would fall for the crap she was going to sell him? She knew deep down that her marriage was on fire, but when she walked into their apartment and found all his belongings gone, she realized she was in a hole she had dug. She sank to the floor, crying bitter tears and cursing her own arrogance. She had no ready explanation for her actions because she never believed that she would be caught, and if she was caught, she would convince her sweet, naive husband to forgive her. She was successful for 3 years, and tonight he burned her marriage and reputation to the ground. The week went by quickly for Mike. He cloned his SIM card before throwing the old one into the dirty city snow so that he could initiate contact, but no one could interrupt his journey through the Old South to his new home in Texas. The emails he set up were sent out all week. Spouse after spouse received an individual letter with an attachment, and marriage after marriage burned down. The thought of this result made Mike smile. The letter to Deirdre's husband was sent yesterday. Thinking about Al's answer made Mike smile widely. Jo was responsible for her own actions, but Deirdre's story of the pleasure she got from her personal experience as a slut and her friends urging to share the joy of spreading her legs really influenced Jo's decision. It was day 4, and back in New York, Deirdre and Jo were sitting on the couch in their apartment. It was now their apartment because Al had kicked Deirdre out after receiving the email and watching the video. It featured 5 segments of sexual activity and an insightful conversation with Jo in which they described their conquests and pleasures, listed their lovers by name, and occasionally laughed at their ignorant husbands. Albert sent copies of this conversation to each of the wives of the named women if he knew them, and he knew most of them. The fire spread, and Albert smiled as he looked at the flames. Things weren't any better for George. His father fired him and disinherited him. In fact, he fired all of the senior executives who were responsible for the firm being blackballed due to their actions, and served as interim CEO while his new VP of Development and Talent Acquisition, Helen, recruited top executives from all over the world. Mike passed the Martin Luther King Boulevard exit and prepared to turn onto Cesar Chavez Street. As he drove past the Austin Convention Center, he saw Lady Bird Lake on his left, crossed Congress Avenue, and arrived at the exclusive high-rise apartment his new company was providing at 70 Rainey. The apartment's rent was paid for 6 months, which gave him time to find the house with trees and lawn that he so dreamed of. Once he is settled, he will buy a dog and begin looking for a new companion who will be reliable and who will enjoy making a home for him and their children. His new partners have already planned a barbecue where they will introduce him as recently divorced and promise that there will be plenty of eligible women there. Meanwhile, in New York City, the fire continued to burn as exposed spouses threw others under the bus and hurt spouses shared what they knew about other hurt spouses. Helen kept Mike up to date. He contemplated the ever-growing flames of the great New York fire he had lit and smiled. The more he heard, the more glad he was that he went to Texas.